A teacher in a small country school a couple of generations ago once asked her pupils to write an essay on anatomy. And one little boy wrote this: "Your head is kind of hard, and your brains are in it, and your hair grows on it. Your face is in front of your head, the place where you eat. Your neck is what keeps your head off your shoulders, which are sort of like shelves where you hook the straps of your overalls. Your arms are what you have to pitch a softball with and to reach for the muffins. Your fingers stick out of your hands so you can scratch, throw a curve, and add arithmetic. Your legs are what you have so you can run to first base. Your feet are what you run on, and your toes are what get stubbed. And that's all there is of you except what is inside. That's all there is of you except what's inside." A few weeks ago, I shared an experience of going on a retreat in LA, and the leader of the retreat was trying to help the clergy be better preachers. And he invited us to write on brown paper lunch sacks the 10 worst experiences of our lives. And then he said, after we kind of relived all those kind of moments, he said, if you have the courage to preach on 2 or 3 of these experiences, they will be the best sermons you will ever preach. And thinking about preaching, preaching is a kind of art form that it's not like a lecture, it's not like a seminar. It is about helping people go inside. It is about looking at the inside stuff. I remember one of our clergy, I was training a new assistant, and this was her second career, and she was a prosecutor. She worked for Janet Reno. And so her first sermons were kind of like this, looking over her glasses and talking to the jury. And that's not what preaching is about. And so she had to kind of find her voice. And preaching is kind of, you're always preaching to yourself. You're always sort of thinking out loud about what are these readings, what are they conjuring up for me? What inner space are they opening up? And often that, what I would call, it's a kind of intimacy dance with ourselves. It's an intimacy dance with ourselves, and sometimes there is conflict going on inside us that we're allowed to kind of explore in this sacred place. There's a book I read many years ago by a woman called Betty Berzone. She's a psychotherapist in Los Angeles, and she did a lot of work with families and couples. And her book is entitled The Intimacy Dance. And so for years and years, couples would come and sit on her couch, and they would be sharing their inner selves. They would be sharing their disappointments and their struggles and their hopes and their fears and their shame and the things that maybe they weren't able to talk about before. And she said a photograph of that intimacy dance, this is one moment where a couple, they were yelling at each other on the couch, but holding hands. That's the intimacy dance. So today in the reading from the Epistle to the Corinthians, we have another picture of an intimacy dance from St. Paul. Think about that reading as a way in which Paul, who probably next to Jesus is the most important person in the Christian movement, there is this moment where Paul becomes enormously vulnerable. He becomes really personal. And he shares 2 experiences. One is the kind of mountaintop experience that he is in the third heaven. Paul is the quintessential mystic. Right? So the pyramid, the top of the pyramid for the mystic is union with God. So the worshiper and the worshipped become one, and he can't find words to describe this experience of union with God. He calls it paradise. And you know, the word paradise is from a Persian word that means a walled garden. And so the king would, for people who he loved and who had done something for him or his country, would call someone a companion of the garden. And you had the privilege of walking with the king in the walled garden. So Paul is describing this intimate relationship with God, union with God. And then he describes this surprising part of Paul, this deep part of him that's very broken. And he talks about the thorn in the flesh. And the Greek word is actually, it's not a thorn, it's a stake. It's a large piece of wood that's in his heart, that's in his brain, that's in his body, that's causing him enormous discomfort. And he prays to God to remove it. And he hears this little voice that my grace is sufficient for you. And that this, whatever this is, that there is something that is made perfect in weakness. And that was part of our reading today. And it's very interesting. You know, Paul, again, the second most important person in the movement, you know, you'd think he'd be able to kind of deal, you know, that God would fix it, but God doesn't fix it. And God says, my grace is sufficient for you. And the context in which, it's interesting, the context that Paul is sharing this with the community, it's like he's doing one of these 10 worst experiences of his life. He's preaching a great sermon. But the context is very interesting because the people that he was communicating with were in conflict, enormous conflict. This was a church community in Corinth, a big city, important port, Christian community that he had founded, and now was in conflict. And there were three issues for that community. One was factionalism, that people were saying, well, I was baptized by Paul, I'm a disciple of Paul, you were baptized by Apollo, and the church was divided. And it was kind of cult of personality. And then the second issue was that there were some Christians who believed that they had superior knowledge. They were better Christians than everybody else. And they had special gifts, and some speaking in dramatic utterances and speaking in tongues. And so they were a better Christian than the other person. And then the third issue was that they were defaming Paul. They were saying he wasn't really a good guy. He wasn't really an apostle. And it's interesting that it's within that context that Paul kind of bears his soul. And he links the idea of being vulnerable and being weak to the image of Jesus. We preach Christ crucified, and it's the foolishness of God. It is not the wisdom of the world. And he kind of reverses the values. Instead of kind of defending himself, and that he actually points to Jesus and the suffering Jesus, and that suffering is transformed by God into something else, and that there's power in that. And he talks about that famous passage that's read at most weddings in Corinthians 13, love is patient and kind, and I may have, speak in tongues of ecstasy, but if I don't have love, I'm nothing. And I may have all mysteries and knowledge, and if I have faith that can move mountains, but I do not have love, I am nothing. So it's interesting, he's addressing these divisions and these factions from a place of great vulnerability. And we know there's more than 2 letters sent to this church, and there are fragments that are put into 2 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians. And so this particular piece is the worst possible time. Paul has visited them, and he couldn't even stay there. They threw him out, and he had to go somewhere else, and he sent his friend Titus to go and kind of reconcile the church. And the good news is that this letter that he sent and the visit of Titus helped to change the situation, and the church kind of realized that they were off course, and they repented, and they got back, and Paul was able to come back and visit his community. But what an amazing story of how when Christians misbehave, what it looks like, right from the beginning, And how we cure that, or how we let the light of God, let the light of the image of the crucified Christ transform those difficult moments. That Christ's power is actually made perfect in weakness. So it was interesting that his roller coaster, his experience, this intimacy dance with God, that the pinnacle experience of paradise is able to give him the courage to remain centered and to be able to deal. He dealt with the defamation, he dealt with the conflict, and he saw the solution. And he was able to do that. So I think about that in our own lives. You know, the intimacy dance we have with ourselves. What is it, that opens and breaks our heart when we are vulnerable? Sometimes it's giving birth to a child. All the defenses and the comfortable security, all of that, our hearts are opened in a new way. And we experience God and creation in a new way. So it's not always about suffering, it can be about joy, that our hearts are cracked open. And that's a part of what we're celebrating today. That intimacy dance with ourselves and our connection to other people and to this world, this fleeting world, in all its complexity, in all its mystery. There's a wonderful story about a wise man who is defamed by another. And in a final act of humiliation and judgment, one man flings a bucket of water over the head of Archelaus the Macedonian. And Archelaus simply stood there and took it, didn't say anything. And when a friend asked him how he could bear it so serenely, he said, "He threw water not on me, but on the man he thought I was." He threw water not on me, but on the man he thought I was. And it's Paul's sense of all-sufficient grace and God's union with him that could allow him to face his opponents and to boast of his weaknesses. And it wasn't a case of pandering to what people thought of you, but resting in the truth that God knew Paul from the inside and loved all that he was in all its complexities. So this intimacy dance with God and with the people of God and the person God wants us to become is the Christian journey. It is living and walking by a different beat. It is difficult to surrender to this new space. And it's not about looking for an easier life and existence, but it is understanding how our participation in this thing we call life and in a body and in relationships, and rising above all that is trivial and sometimes hurts us and causes us grief and pain, that God knows. And that there is some eternal significance to this mystery of what fleeting human experience might give to us. So a lot to think about today. And I close with some profound words from Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, who's actually buried. He's in the Jesuit cemetery at the CIA in Poughkeepsie. And he once said this: "You are not a human being in search of a spiritual experience. You are a spiritual being immersed in a human experience." You are not a human being in search of a spiritual experience. You are a spiritual being immersed in a human experience. Amen.